Welcome to the Libertarian Institute podcast. My name is Keith Knight. I'm managing editor at the Libertarian Institute. I'm joined by my news editor, Kyle Anzalone. Please check the link in the description. You can check out libertarianinstitute.org/donate, where you can make a donation and write it off on your taxes, most importantly. And you can get one of our books in exchange, whether it's an ebook or a physical copy, depending on the size of your donation. We also have handbags available. Great conversation starters when you're out on the town trying to promote the Institute or just have productive conversations with people around you. We do have matching funds. Every dollar you donate, as of now, will be matched. Kyle Anselone, thank you for joining me, brother.
Thanks for having me back, Keith. Always great to talk to you.
You recently published this piece, Doctors Without Borders Condemns Israeli Siege of Gaza. When did this siege begin?
So really, Gaza has been under siege since the disengagement, if we really want to go back. But the current siege that they're
What
talking
year
about,
what year was the disengagement you're
it
referring
would
to?
be 2006 when Israel vacated the settlements from the Gaza Strip. I think more, to the point here of this news story, we're really talking about since March 1st. And so what happened, Keith, is you remember when Trump came into office, there was some real celebration and optimism. We all expected that Donald Trump was going to be better than Joe Biden when it came to the war in Ukraine. And while he certainly hasn't lived up to expectations, you can't deny that at least putting some pressure on Zelensky is better than what Harris would be doing. But when it came to Gaza, everybody knew that the policy would be bad. I think there was a real hope, though, when right before Trump came into office, there was a deal negotiated, not a peace deal, a ceasefire and hostage agreement negotiated between Israel and Hamas. And all the leaders of, Arab states and Israeli officials were saying that this only got done because of the pressure that Trump put on Netanyahu. There was a report that he sent his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Israel on the Sabbath. And when they told Witkoff that Netanyahu doesn't receive visitors today, he said he receives me, essentially. Wake his ass up and we're gonna have a conversation. And so this is the way that I think Americans should want a state that takes 20 something billion dollars from us a year to be treated, where like, you are going to do what is best for us when we ask you to, or you're not going to get all this money. And so there was some real optimism and celebration of this apparent change in attitude, right? Like, we all want Netanyahu to get the Zelensky treatment next time he goes to the White House. And, really unfortunately, Keith, since that deal took effect on January 19th, the day before Trump took office, Israel really hasn't lived up to their end. They have allowed in quite a bit more food aid and other types of assistance. But importantly, they were supposed to allow in 200,000 tents and 60,000 mobile homes. And a lot of the Palestinian population, it seems well over 1 million people, are living in tents and makeshift shelters. And, these are canvas tents. They're meant to, I think, last a few months or something like that. Certainly not over a year, and not over a year when it's being picked up and put down and moved around in a war zone. And so there are babies in Gaza that are freezing to death because, they lack adequate shelter. Their parents are sleeping in makeshift tents that are beaten up by the weather in the middle of the night. And so Israel doesn't allow in a lot of the aid they're supposed to. Additionally, I think they killed about 150 Palestinians during the first 6 weeks of the ceasefire. And then at the same time, Keith, there was this hostage exchange going on. And so generally speaking, Israel wasn't bombing Gaza for the first 6 weeks of the Trump administration. But then it was supposed to enter into phase 2 on March 1st. And what Israel said is, rather than going into phase 2, which will see the rest of the release of the rest of the Israeli captives, in exchange, Israel was supposed to withdraw its forces from Gaza and allow the war to permanently end. But they're now saying, no, we don't want to move on to phase 2. We just want Hamas to release the rest of the Israeli hostages. And unless they do that, we're not going to allow any aid into Gaza, no food, no fuel. And then they've also shut off the electricity and blocked the medical aid as well. And so now there's a shortage of water on top of everything else.
What is Hamas saying that their desire to have the hostages as leverage? What is the purpose? Are they saying we want our own state, we want our own hostages back, we want all of Palestine back to 47? What is Hamas asking for?
Yeah, so I think right now the Hamas demands are centered around a permanent end to the fighting. They do want some more Palestinian essentially hostages released. Some people are convicted of crimes, but many others that Israel are releasing are women and children. People who have not been convicted of any crime are essentially political prisoners who are getting out of jail. There's some doctors who were captured in Gaza for saving lives on the battlefield, and then they were, taken to the Israeli jails and things like that. And they want those people released. But generally speaking, Hamas wants an end to the fighting, and then an Israel withdrawal of its military forces from the strip. And Hamas is willing to not be the governing body of Gaza after this is over, although it's kind of unclear if they're for completely disbanding or disarming. But it does seem like they're willing to let a different group be the governance.
You mentioned the statement from Doctors Without Borders, which says, Doctors Without Borders strongly condemns the Israeli imposed siege on Gaza, which is depriving people of basic services and critical supplies, including access to water, by cutting electricity supply. How long have they been able to cut the electricity to Gaza? Is this something they've been able to do since 2006? Because that would certainly mean that Gaza's not necessary, or that Hamas is not necessarily the state. It appears that the Israeli government is the monopoly on violence in this area.
Right. Well, I think effectively they've been the monopoly on violence in Gaza since 67. But, since 2006 may be a good date. Although I know over time there was some, local ability of Gaza to actually produce some energy that has been degraded through the various bombing campaigns. And so I'm not exactly sure of when, say, the people of Gaza couldn't produce any of their own electricity. But as you mentioned there, Israel is the monopoly on violence. At any point in time, they could shut off the electricity in Gaza, even if not maybe directly like at the power plant, flipping the switch. They could bomb it. They could, impose some kind of other siege. They could not allow, replacement parts to get into the strip. They effectively controlled the strip, uh, you know, again, since 67, but particularly since 2006 when they pulled the settlers out and then just put up a fence around the Gaza Strip.
When it comes to the American-Israeli relationship, do you see APAC? I always forget that acronym. Is it the American Israeli Political Action Committee?
Yeah, I think so.
Uh, do you see them as having a very large amount of power and influencing politicians, or is it people already have these beliefs and that's reflected with their alliance with APAC? Who do you think is really calling the shots here?
Well, I guess a little bit of both, right? Where APAC invests so much money to either try to keep out people from Congress who are not, I wouldn't call Thomas Massey anti-Israel, right? He wants Israel to be treated like a normal US ally, essentially, right? Where we don't give them unlimited amounts of military aid. We don't pretend that they don't have a nuclear program when they do. There are ways Israel could be treated as a far more normal ally, and people advocate for that. And the Israel lobby, excuse me, will do everything they can to keep that person from entering Congress. Hell, this is so pervasive, Keith. Some girl that I went to college with, Heritage 101, was my buddy on the first day. I remember this girl. She was running for Congress, and they ran like $400,000 of flyers against her in support of Danny Davis, and I think it's the South Side of Chicago there. Claiming she's pro Hamas and other absurd things. And it's just, this is a real problem that they have so much influence. And it starts out, at the level where if you get elected, or if you're even the candidate's primary, right? Like she was running in the Democrat primary race, because this is always a blue district. And so even on the primary level, there's just so much influence and control over who gets to even be on the ballot. They Thomas Massey pointed out they recently tried to unseat him. I think like $500,000 was spent, and that was in the Republican primary. But also we see it at the top too, where Miriam Adelson donates $100 million to the Trump campaign. And Keith, I don't know if you saw this yesterday, but Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, one of the really, really great foreign policy thinkers we have, when Trump took office and we were putting together our wish list of who would be in his cabinet, my pick either for a top defense or intelligence official was Daniel Davis. And here he was, Tulsi Gabbard was going to make him his deputy at DNI. I mean, this was huge. And yesterday morning, I saw Bill Kristol tweeted out this article from Jewish Insider about, oh, we can't have this guy in government. He hates the Jews. Well, what has he said? War with Iran is bad. We shouldn't give Israel all this endless support. And just basic non-interventionist policy, the same kind of policy that, me and you advocate for. And obviously it's not coming from any view of anti-Semitism. It's just going to treat Tel Aviv as any other country should be treated, and not this special relationship where they get so much influence in our country and get so much of our money and our weapons. And, because of, his anti-Israel policies, by the end of the day, Kelly Vlahos at the Quincy Institute was reporting that he had lost the potential to have that job. And so there's just so much influence, Keith.
You have an article here, Zelensky. Kiev won't cede territory, wants strong U.S. response if Russia rejects ceasefire. What is the update between Ukraine, Russia, and what has taken place now?
Yeah, Keith. So earlier this week, we had a meeting between American and U.S. officials in Saudi Arabia. I believe Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, and Rubio were leading the American delegation. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. And what happened there is the Americans and the Ukrainians, I guess agreed is the word that everybody's using, to a 30-day ceasefire where they would then negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. And after they announced this, immediately, Keith, we have seen this so many times, right, with COVID or with the war in Ukraine, where one Western leader will say something and it'll be repeated everywhere. Right. And then, that's a point of the propaganda. That's a key piece of the narrative. And what Rubio said, the ball is now in Russia's court. And then Mike Waltz said, oh, yeah, we're restarting the military aid and the intelligence for Ukraine. And so we have this, seeming shift here, right, where previously it seemed that the Trump administration was really going to force Ukraine to take the kind of position needed to take to end this conflict. But now it seems like they kind of switched back to the Biden administration, where we're sending them weapons and we're demanding Russia accept something that they have said time and time again that they're not going to accept. And so, we have all these Western leaders, we have all these American politicians. The ball is now in Russia's court. The ball is now in Russia's court. And while the ball is in Russia's court, Zelensky is on our side of the court yelling, we're not going to make territorial concessions. And this is a key red line for Moscow. They've made very clear the 5 Ukrainian oblasts that they have annexed, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, will remain Russia at the end of this conflict, and that's a non-negotiable position. And so Russia has also made clear that they're not willing to accept a temporary ceasefire if there's not a potential for that to reach a larger deal, right? And so I think what Zelensky is trying to do here, Keith, is to make it clear to the Russian side that this temporary ceasefire is not on reasonable grounds, on grounds that the Russians will agree to end this war. And then he's hoping that the Russians then tell the Americans that, no, we're not going to enter into this ceasefire, because step 2 of this was apparently he was told by Waltz and Rubio that if Russia rejects this agreement, then the Americans, will start sending the Ukrainians more weapons and give them more support, as well as add sanctions on Russia. And so it seems there's a real risk here that this could essentially flip the position, where now Trump is ramping up the proxy war in Ukraine in his mind to end it, right? Because everything is peace through strength. The only reason Russia even invaded Ukraine, don't you know, Keith, is because Joe Biden looked so weak and incompetent in Afghanistan. It had nothing to do with the fact that maybe Donald Trump started sending Javelin missiles to Kiev during his administration. No responsibility there. It was just because Biden looked weak. And so, one more update on this just before we went live here. I think Putin started to issue his response to the ceasefire proposal, and it seems he's trying to punt the ball back to the American side by saying that he's receptive to it, but details need to be discussed. And so we'll see how the U.S. responds to that. If we're willing to engage in talks, then maybe we are starting to move down the right road here. If the U.S. just says, no, what's on the table is what's on the table, I think Russia probably rejects it.
And you're saying what's on the table is concession of the 5 oblasts that you mentioned?
No, well, that's what Russia wants overall. That's not, it's just a 30-day ceasefire on the table, I think, is all the Americans are really proposing here, with no real indication that the Ukrainians have moved close enough to a position that the Russians would take, which I think is what Russia wants to see before they enter into a temporary ceasefire. Russia is making major ground. This is another article I wrote recently for the Institute. They captured 12 villages and towns in the Kursk region. This is a Russian region that was taken partially by Ukraine middle of last year. And they have made some of their most significant gains in Kursk in the past few days, Keith. And they've also taken a key village in the Donetsk region as well, which should open them up to taking even more territory there. And so Russia is unlikely to agree to a ceasefire at this point because, they're on the offensive. Any ceasefire is going to allow the Ukrainians to dig in and build up their defense positions a little bit more.
When it comes to the origins of the conflict, you mentioned that, of course, NATO expansion is a much more plausible explanation than Biden's incompetency. Oliver Stone once asked Vladimir Putin, he's like, you've met with President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama. I mean, you've seen Republicans and Democrats. Well, what is it that really changes between these parties? I mean, this is a very wide-ranging group of people. To which Putin responded, it's called the Putin interviews on Showtime. He goes, really, the president changes, but the policy never changes. So when it comes to the origins of this conflict, what is it that people need to know? Are you saying it's NATO expansion? Are you saying it's potential color revolutions? What is at the root of this issue? What started it? And what are some lessons we can learn?
Oh man, well, I have a 600-page book in front of me that I could start reading from, and that would get to all the answers. And I start off that way, Keith, just to let people know that if I don't say the thing that you think really contributed to it, it's because there's so much. I think that's what we need to look at here: the totality of the evidence that the U.S. has just done so much in taking advantage of Russia's weakness at the end of the Cold War to push on Russia's borders. And hell, I mean, there's even a real possibility here, Keith, that the war in Ukraine is just another Western effort to create regime change in Moscow this time, that they're just continuing to push on this. I mean, what is it that Hillary Clinton did after Russia invaded Ukraine? She cackled and talked about how this was going to be the next Afghanistan, comparing it to what happened during the Soviet Union. And there is this 2019 RAND report that basically says how to weaken and overextend Russia. And basically they want to create the downfall of Putin's government in Moscow. And they talk about, trying to conduct a regime change in Belarus and these Central Asian states. And this is all things that have continued to happen. Really, the one thing that didn't happen the way they anticipated was the Ukrainian military stood up a lot better than they thought they would, right? They had anticipated that Ukraine would fall. And what would happen is all these Ukrainian nationalists and Nazis, right? All the people that the CIA had trained for years and years and years would wage an insurgency against the Russians, right? And start, blowing up different things. And it would happen inside Russia because this would all be Russian territory. Russia was supposed to take Ukraine. And when that didn't happen, now Russia's locked in this multi-year war and the West is backing Russia. And I think, they see it as, again, for every 10 Ukrainian soldiers that die, if one or two Russians die, then that's a victory, right? Because Russia is weaker. This isn't about Ukraine. It was never about Ukraine.
I was pleasantly surprised when Tulsi Gabbard became the director of national intelligence, but it was such a childish celebration on my end. I'm like, here's the one you guys called a Putin puppet, calling her a toady for Bashar al-Assad, and now she's in James Clapper's position. That was just so sweet. Now, I need you to either talk me down or talk me up on this. Are you happy with what Tulsi Gabbard has done recently? Do you think there's a lot of potential there? Or was this more or less just a nice way to put some egg on the face of the deep state without getting anything out of it?
Well, I guess as far as I know, I haven't seen any major moves by Tulsi at DNI that are, worth breaking down. I guess the reason I'm still hopeful about Tulsi, and I know she has her shortcomings, and we could certainly people could look at and discuss those, but where one place that she's always been good is being concerned about the Salafist Sunni jihadists in Syria, and these are the people that now control the country. And so I guess the risk is that she goes too far and we end up going to war against Damascus again, this time against the Sunnis, who we just had to overthrow the Alawite Bashar al-Assad. But at the same time, the Biden administration was really moving towards embracing Jolani and Al Qaeda in Syria. We had sent Barbara Leaf, the State Department official, over to meet with him, and another U.S. official met with him under Biden. We took the $10 million bounty off his head. I'm pretty sure if it wasn't for Trump taking office, they probably would have delisted Harit Tahrir al-Sham HTS, which is the al-Nusra Front or al-Qaeda in Syria. Al-Jolani has one thing. He's kind of a chameleon. He rebrands a lot in order to, court favor, or at least not so much animosity from the West. And so, having Tulsi in this key intelligence role, I do think is important to keeping us from embracing this government. I mean, Keith, I couldn't imagine a more dangerous and stupid policy as putting jihadists in charge of Syria, allowing them to loot Syrian financial institutions and armories, while at the same time backing Israel as they take swaths of Syria, swaths of Lebanon, and then conduct a full-on genocide in Gaza, while also starting to trample all over the West Bank. I mean, not only are you injecting a huge amount of weapons and money into the hands of absolute religious lunatics, but then you're giving them something to point at and say, here, look at what the Americans are doing to our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And everybody looks at that and they're just horrified and disgusted, right? When everybody looks at the videos that are coming out of Gaza, or they read the stories about babies freezing to death, these are the kinds of things that make young men pick up arms and do absolutely terrible things. And so to have these policies going on at the same, I just can't imagine doing anything more stupider or more anti-American than that.
There is a general claim that if you're critical of a certain government, then you are criticizing the entire people of that nation and you don't care about that nation. You don't support the war in Afghanistan by the Americans, you must hate America. You don't support Israel's ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza, you must be an anti Semite. It's all too predictable. If we say, you know what, I only care about Israel, it's my favorite country on the entire planet, couldn't there be an argument that you would still oppose Israel's operations in Gaza and the West Bank, considering the hit to popularity that the Israeli state has taken in the last, gosh, how long has it been? Like 2 years? Is it just me, or is there actual empirical evidence that even Israel itself is being harmed in terms of public opinion as a cause of result of their actions in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the case. And this is one of the great things about having independent media and why people need to support the Institute and all kinds of, independent outlets, because what is changing people's outlook is that you don't just get 90 seconds on the nightly news saying that Israel continues to respond to October 7th and try to free its captives today. No, you get the raw, uncut footage of the horrific things that Israel is doing. And Keith, I just need 30 seconds to usher one of my puppies out of the room. I'll be right back.
Oh, no problem at all. One thing that I want to go over is I was very disappointed in so many progressives who, correctly criticized the actions of the Israeli government in response to October 7th and just the horrific videos coming out of Gaza. I was very disappointed when I saw Brianna Joy Gray the other day on the Piers Morgan show talking about how people like Dave Rubin, millionaires, should be paying more in taxes. Here you have a woman who, for some time, has correctly been saying the Americans and the Israelis are committing mass murder in Gaza. That's totally legitimate. And her response is to say, well, in the meantime, ideally, we'll fix the American government in the long run. But in the short run, people should be paying even more in taxes to the organization which I'm accusing of committing genocide. The amount of cognitive dissonance that is embraced by so many progressives on this issue happens on the right as well. Even Tucker Carlson, who I really like, was saying the other day, why should I care so much about Ukraine? It's a foreign country. We have our own issues. We shouldn't be worrying about others. They're thousands of miles away. Let's worry about ourselves. Well, Piers Morgan then says, so the US shouldn't be supporting Israel? And he goes, and Tucker Carlson just says, well, I don't even know what support means, that they're an ally. I don't even know what ally means anymore. Kyle, what do you think about the blatant contradiction when the progressive says the government's committing genocide, also you should give them more money? Or when the person on the right says we should worry about ourselves, not foreign countries, oh, but Israel should more or less get a blank check? Why do you think there was such a blatant contradiction in the thinking among both parties on this issue?
I mean, I think it's kind of for the reason we talked about at first, where so many of the people who come into power only come into power because of their positions on this issue in the first place. And it gets very hard to change your mind. And to Tucker Carlson's credit, he's one of the few people, in positions of power who ever kind of publicly changed their mind and realized they made a mistake, particularly on the foreign policy issue. I mean, you could count the people on, one hand, like Walter Jones, who, yes, was once trumpeting freedom fries. That's why I remember that guy as. But then, as I got a little bit older, I was like, oh, look, this guy's now at the Ron Paul Institute. And one of the most outspoken and best voices on this issue. And so some people do change, but I think generally speaking, elected politicians don't change unless they really, really have to. And even though the polling on Israel is shifting and Americans are becoming less favorable towards Israel, it certainly hasn't yet shifted in a way, say that, opinion of the Iraq war shifted, right? Like, it just hasn't gotten there yet. And I worry that it won't, because ultimately, it's so much of a foreign issue. And then even when it does become a domestic issue, there's such narrative control on, oh, that's anti-Semitism, right? Like, if you're saying that blowback terrorism originates, or at least part of it, with American support for Israel, that's a Jewish conspiracy. And so that's the way that the narrative is controlled, and that I think they really try to obscure some of Israel's involvement in what's happened negatively in the United States. And so um it's hard for me to think that there's going to be a lot of change on this issue. It's always shocking to me, I guess, more so on the right than the left. I guess I just have a slightly higher opinion of Republicans, and that what we've seen here on college campuses with Mahood Khalil, who was protesting, right? Like, this was the one thing that I really did think would be better of Trump versus Harris, was we were going to end this whole disinformation campaign, all this insane narrative control, these crackdowns on First Amendment speech. I mean, Donald Trump said at his a joint address to Congress, free speech is back in America. That includes speech that you disagree with, Mr. President. That includes people who are pro-Palestinian, or even people who are pro-terrorist, which he is not. But even if he was, free speech is free speech. There is no like, if you talk bad on Israel, you don't have free speech anymore. But this is a part of the right wing exception for Israel that we always see.
The libertarian lesson that I think we can extract from all this is why I think the Libertarian Institute is so important in the general framing when it comes to warfare. This is a lesson from a former economist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, in a book titled Economy, Society, and History. He says, first, we should recognize that institutions such as states show a natural aggressiveness. The explanation is very simple. If you have to fund your own aggressive adventures yourself out of your own pocket, that will somewhat curtail your natural inclination to fight other people because you have to pay for it yourself. On the other hand, if you imagine that if I want to fight some of you guys and I can tax him or him and ask them to support me in my fighting endeavors, then whatever my initial aggressive impulses might be are certainly stimulated because I can externalize the cost of war on other people. I don't have to bear the cost myself. Other people have to bear the cost. This explains why institutions that have the power to tax and also institutions that have the power to print money in later ages have financial abilities that make it more likely that they go to war than they would go to war if the power to tax was lacking or the power to print money was lacking. This is so important because you give the state a blank check, and ideally, they're just providing basic goods and services for everyone who can't get them through the voluntary market. Unfortunately, with that blank check comes the caveat that they don't have to spend it on only the things you want. It also comes with the judicial ability to kill people with legal immunity, and they're never brought up on murder charges. So I think this framework of libertarianism is so important when it comes to the concept of war. It's not completely separate from the right to take money coercively and using that money to install favorable regimes and kill millions of civilians in the process. That's why I think having a libertarian understanding is key to any anti war movement, any anti war advocacy like the MAGA right or the progressive left that doesn't get to the heart of statism, I think is more or less bound to fail. Kyle, any thoughts on that or any closing things you want to mention on any of the conflicts before we close out?
Oh, I mean, that is such a interesting insight, right? About how when you could this state and why it's so aggressive and not taking on any of the costs. And then I mean, even more so when you look at the war in Ukraine, where American officials have openly bragged that Russia is being weakened with no American blood being spilled. Right, like they see this. They've got the Ukrainians as meat beds. They're just their bodies to be thrown out there to bleed Russia with is just is absolutely unbearable to think about what our government has done to Ukraine. And of course, it's even worse too, where it's not that our leaders just don't bear a cost, but they profit off of it. Right, that like they are making money. They are all a part of the military industrial complex. A lot of the Israel lobby money, a lot of that also gets funding from either countries that buy a lot of American weapons who want more American weapons, or from American arms manufacturers. And so there's just so much here that they profit off of it and through death, and so they do love war. But I think that's all I have today, Keith.
Thank you to everyone for listening to the Libertarian Institute podcast. Check out libertarianinstitute.org/books if you want to look at the many books that we have published at the Institute. Check out libertarianinstitute.org/donate if you want to help us out, help us fight the statists who continue to justify their violence with fake things like a constitutional justification, even when they never declare war. They continuously tell us they are working on our behalf, even when they disavow our explicit opposition to things like the ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza. Kyle Anzalone, thank you for your time, brother.
Thanks, Keith.